Morning everyone. Jesus promised his followers a full and fulfilled life. I hope you're experiencing that today. I hope God's grace is in your life today and that you're recognising it and thereby experiencing a full and fulfilled life. If not, maybe this will help, at least in a small way. Baby steps, I suppose. Talking with some friends this morning on Zoom, and we were talking about what life might look like after COVID-19. And the idea of stance and gesture, or posture and gesture rather, came up. It was a bit of a new idea. Not all of us think in those terms, and I certainly hadn't in the past, but posture, in the way that I understand it, is about how we stand over and against others. Gesture is about the things we do for others, our generosity and our welcoming attitude. Although maybe that has more to do with posture. What immediately came to mind when I was thinking about this was, on the one hand, two boxers ready to beat the living daylights out of each other in the ring. A warlike posture, a posture of battle. And the other one, at the other extreme, was the posture of the peacemaker. Somebody who humbly comes to two warring parties and attempts in humility and with gentleness to bring them to a table for reconciliation, to a table where they might discover the similarities that they share. The commonalities and the goals that they have in mind. Usually in warring parties, both ultimately want peace. So how can peace be achieved? And the peacemaker is the person who brings the invitation. So two vastly different positions. And we were asking these questions about church life, about congregational life, and what stance we take. I raised the issue that I think most congregations want to be welcoming, and for the most part are, but for the most part the only people who generally turn up on a Sunday morning are people much like us, middle class, middle income, middle of the road ideas about life and how to live it, much like us, not too many extremes. But Jesus spent his life amongst the extremes. He spent his time with the hyper-religious, trying to get them to settle down and to see the world differently and be a little more compassionate, respectful and gracious. Excuse me. And then he spent time with marginalised people, with prostitutes and tax collectors. And tax collectors in those days were rip-off merchants for the most part. They collected taxes on behalf of Rome, but they also lined their pockets at the expense of everybody else. So they were thieves, essentially. And Jesus spent time with people who were outcast from general society, not middle of the road, not middle class, not like many of those who sit in churches on a Sunday morning. So my question was, what do we as Christians look like to those who observe us? Do we look more like the super religious, those who are full of judgment and condemnation? Look, we may not be, but stereotypes these days have got us to a place where many people think that's who we are, even if we're not. So how do we counteract that? How do we step out of that stereotype and demonstrate that we're not judgmental, harsh people? How do we show the love of God in the way that we stand towards other people? Are we ready for a fight? Are we ready to say, bring it on if somebody challenges us? Or are we more like the peacemaker who brings people to a table, who's interested in listening, excuse me, to those who come, interested in perceiving the gifts they have to offer at the table? Most congregations like to think of themselves as welcoming places, but really, are we? We do welcome those who are like ourselves, but what if the extremes come along? What if, just for example, let's say a man in his 50s, late 50s, dressed in high-heel platform shoes and pink hot pants, turns up at the door on Sunday. Now, we want to be welcoming, And I'm sure we would go through the motions and do all the polite middle-class things of demonstrating that kind of welcomeness and bring them inside. But what does our response say? What does our immediate response say? Does our look of shock and pain say something to that person? Do we give them the right and the possibility to judge us immediately based on our reaction? What would have Jesus' reaction been like? I think it would have been completely the peacemaker. I don't think he would have looked at the man as if he was odd compared to myself. I think he would have looked at him and gone, wow, that's a really flash outfit. That's really bright. I love it. And I love the fact that you are willing to wear it in public, because that just tells me how willing you are to be yourself and not care about anybody else. Not care about what they think. You should come in here. There are a lot of people in here who need you because they're too worried about what other people think. You're a great example of what it is to live life without other people worrying about what other people think of you. I'm glad you're here and you've got something to offer us. Please come in. Would that be our response? Or would it just be awkward politeness and stuttering and shuffling around and getting him inside and then trying to avoid him as much as possible? That's the way it used to be. I don't think we are quite that way anymore, but I don't think we're ready for the really weird and outrageous. I don't think we're ready for that. We should be, because to be a child of God, to be dearly loved by God, is also to be a disciple and to be a disciple maker. And that's somebody who doesn't do it by force, by battery, through a fight, but somebody who's a peacemaker and who's interested genuinely in people, wanting to hear their story and to see the gifts that they bring to community. That's who we can be, but we can't be taken by surprise any longer. We have to prepare ourselves and ask ourselves, what has our stance been to others when they come along? What does our stance look like to the community? Do they still stereotype us? And really, to be honest, stereotyping is rightly so. You can understand people jumping to those universal judgments about Christians on the basis of those who have been outrageous in their behaviour towards marginalised people. How do other people see us? Maybe that's the question we should be asking. What does our stance look like to others? What does it look like to Jesus? Do we genuinely stand in his shoes with open arms and smiles and a welcome to everyone who comes along? Or do we stand in judgment? If you watched last week's sermon in the book of Matthew, Jesus' conversation about judgment comes immediately after his conversation about worry. In the end, judgment of others is about worry of how people perceive us, who we are seen to be with, who we are willing to be with. And all that matters in the end is how Jesus sees us, how the Father sees us. What other people think is beside the point. This was Jesus' attitude. He was only concerned about the Father and how the Father saw him, as gracious, as standing with open arms to all comers. Paul, in his book on Romans and his other writings, says that he's become all things to all people. An open stance, like Jesus, welcoming all comers. The very beige and normal, the very bright pink and weird. Jesus invites us all. In fact, he invites us all to let out the inner weird in loving and respectful ways, so that we might benefit each other with our own type of weird. In Jesus' name, I hope you're at peace today. Have a full life. Amen. For more thoughts of the day, Bible teachings or other resources, please go to the Church Online tab at livingfaith.org.au.